Now, there are mixed reaction to the DA's promise to create 2 million jobs and end load shedding. Party leader John Steenhuisen yesterday outlined 7 key priorities to rescue the South African situation during their election manifesto launch. The official opposition also promised an increase in social grants and vowed to end BEE and cadre deployment. For more on this conversation, we're joined now by DA Head of Policy, Matt Cuthbert. Matt, good to have you, and thank you very much for coming on this evening. How credible are your commitments made, considering the state of the country and where we are?
Good evening, Thabo, and thank you so much for having me on your show this evening. It's always great to have conversations around our ideas and our solutions. And I believe that we've got a very credible plan going into this election campaign, and also to try and turn our country around and get us back on the right trajectory towards prosperity. And I think the reason is because we are acutely aware of the fiscal constraints that we face, noting that there's not sufficient money in the budget, that we are going to go into state institutions that have been hollowed up by cadre deployment and corruption, and that it's going to take some time for us to be able to get the right mechanisms in place for us to be able to deliver on our manifesto. I think it also acknowledges the fact that there are certain lived realities in South Africa which need to be addressed, and it's important that we are cognizant of those as we develop our plans and as we plan to implement them if we get into government in 2024. And I think that that's why this sets us apart from other political parties, because we've really taken a lot of time and effort to make sure that what we are promising and what we are committing to in our rescue plan is something that we can tangibly deliver on, building on our track record of governance in over 30 municipalities across the country, as well as in one province in the Western Cape. And I think it's now about expanding that footprint outwards and making sure that we are able to work together with both business, civil society and the public to make sure that we're able to rescue our beautiful country.
Yeah. So, I mean, key amongst the issues, South Africa's education system, not well positioned at this particular point to respond, many are saying, to the unemployment challenges that we are facing in the country in terms of the skills that we are tuning up. What is your big idea around that? Also considering, I mean, how the Western Cape has performed in the final results.
Sure. So our big idea here is to make sure that we are able to triple the number of grade 4 learners that can read at an appropriate level and comprehend. And it sounds like a rather simplistic goal, but it's really crucial considering how poorly we've performed across competency tests that have been rolled out internationally. And I think we spend sufficient money on education, but we're not getting value for the money that we're spending. And a large resulting factor of that is because of the teacher unions that have taken over competency testing, have made sure that the quality of teaching and education that our learners get is deficient. And this obviously disempowers people from being able to access economic opportunities later on in life. And whilst we spend a significant amount of money on this particular line item in the budget, there's not enough emphasis on making sure that our children are getting a full 210 days of school, that they are finishing the curriculum, and that there's enough time that is devoted to reading, writing, and counting. And that's where our real emphasis will be. These are some of the measures that we've put in place in the Western Cape provincial government and in the Western Cape province, and things that we want to roll out at a national level, considering the fact that we have a highly constrained fiscal environment, that there are a number of other challenges that are apparent in that area, and it's important for us to be able to focus on those basics and make sure that regardless of where you come from, you have the ability to access quality education that allows you to live a life of upward social mobility.
So you're saying that as the DA, you're going to triple the number of grade 4 learners who can read, and you're saying your big thing there is to focus on early childhood development. How different is that from what other parties are saying? I think even the ANC is saying this is the year for early childhood development.
So I think early childhood development is a phase before that, and we do mention that in our rescue plan, but I think this is particularly on the foundation phase. And studies across the world show that the first 3-4 years of schooling are most important in the foundation phase. And you would see in our performance in international testing, such as 81% of our learners not being able to read for meaning. It's important that we focus on this, and we think there needs to be dedicated time focused on making sure that children are reading, that they're able to comprehend the ideas that they engage with in the learning material that they get, to make sure that we give them that step ahead that allows them to actually take advantage of opportunities later on down the line. Because a vast reason why we sit with the economic and unemployment crisis that we do is because we don't have adequate skills. And the most important development phase in a child's life is that particularly foundation phase, and that's why we put such a large emphasis on it, and that's why we surrounded our bold idea around that too.
Yeah, so your point is that teachers must be at school for at least 210 full teaching days, and a part of your big idea there, I suppose you would want to deal a lot with SATU, you're saying, and their interference in terms of the labor issues that they would raise.
Yes, certainly. And I think the other thing is that teachers, particularly aligned to SATU, have refused to undergo competency testing. Now, in many other fields across the board, if you want to be able to get an incentive, whether that be a bonus or a promotion, you have to constantly be assessed on what your performance is and what the outcomes are. And as we know, the educational outcomes that we receive in this country are exceptionally poor. Yet teachers are not being held accountable. And it seems as if the current national government are more interested in protecting teachers' interests over that of learners. And that's why we believe we need to shift the focus, and we've got to make sure that we've got competent teachers that are teaching our learners, that they are properly assessed, and that also our learners are measured according to their abilities to make sure that we're able to see that kind of improvement we're looking for, where we're saying we want to triple the number of grade 4 learners that can read for meaning. And I think that's why it's so important for us to be able to introduce all of these mechanisms like we've done in the Western Cape with the School Evaluation Authority to make sure that there's quality control in place and that the money that is being spent by government actually generates value and actually adds value to the learners who are participating in our schools.
So let's look at the other one. More than 40% of South Africans, it is said, depending on which number you're looking at, need employment, meaning that 9 million South Africans, large number of them being young people, are not capable of finding work at this particular point, and others have even given up on that. What is your bold solution there?
So our bold solution there is a youth employment opportunity certificate, and understanding that it is exceptionally difficult as a young person to find a job in this country, with almost 70% of them being unemployed. It's important that we make it easier for people to access jobs, and often they're priced out of the market because of the labor market regulations that we have in place. And what we're saying is you can apply online and you'll be able to get the certificate, and there's certain conditions related to wages which you could choose to forego, and that would be your own decision, so that you're able to get your foot in the door, build experience, be able to get promoted, and be able to actually build a life of meaning. Because I think there's often an argument which says that people would much rather stay at home and be reliant on the state, and I don't truly believe that. I think if there was real economic opportunity out there, and we had the kind of environment where jobs were being created, where businesses were investing money in skilling people up, then we would see a very different situation. Now, we spoke about education earlier, and we spoke of the importance of getting those interventions right. However, those interventions do take some time in order for them to actually bed in and for us to realize the results of that. And we believe that by tweaking and loosening the labor market, we'll be able to create a much quicker change and be able to open up the kind of economic opportunities that our young people are so desperate for in this country.
So, I mean, you've got laws in the country that are said to be fair, that are said to prohibit unfair discrimination in the workplace in particular, that guarantee equal opportunity and fair treatment to all employees. And you say your big idea is to say to young people, well, if you're willing to forego all these other things and take the minimum wages that you can get just to get your foot in the door, sign this contract here. Is that not a little bit exploitative?
Well, I think there are a number of conditions in the Basic Conditions of Employment Act that cannot be violated. However, this is somebody using their own agency. And ultimately, if you look at the simple decision that people have, if you sit at home and you are able to get a SRD grant of 350 Rand, it will take you an enormous amount of time to be able to make up even half of what the minimum wage is in a given year. And I think that's the important thing, is that the longer you are unemployed, the longer you stay unemployed, and the more likely you are to be unemployed for the rest of your life. And I think often what has happened is we price people out of experience and the opportunity to be able to succeed. And this is why I think this is a critical proposal for us to be able to introduce, And there may be people who criticize the idea, but ultimately the status quo is not working. We've had a policy suite in place for the last 30 years that has not been able to uplift people and get them into economic opportunity. And we think that it's important that we set out a fresh set of clear ideas that are going to change the game and going to allow young people to actually access opportunity.
So where does that put some of the issues, for example, in terms that are covered within the Act, including overtime, including hours of work, including leave, and so on and so forth?
So it would predominantly be regarding wages, and this also links to another, piece of labour regulation which is in place, and that's the extension of collective wage agreements. So businesses, unions will sit in a room where, particularly small businesses are excluded. They'll decide on what a sectoral wage is, and people will be left out of those discussions, even though they have small businesses that need to employ, similar profile of staff. And they are then forced to actually apply that wage, despite the fact that they have much smaller businesses. They've got different financial considerations and not often able to compete in that same space. But yet they are forced to comply with that. And that's difficult. How do you reconcile the fact that you're not in the room to make a decision or to be able to put your point of view forward, but you must now be a wage taker because the big business and unions have decided for you? And that's why I think it's so critical that we don't just look at this particular bold solution, but we look at it in combination with the other measures which we've proposed in our manifesto, because I think it's important that we don't view these things in isolation and we see how they work together to create opportunity, to make it easier for people to actually live lives of meaning and to be able to develop as they move up the social mobility ladder.
Back live with you. Here, still with us, Head of Policy for the Democratic Alliance, Matt Cuthbert. They launched their manifesto yesterday out in Ekurhuleni. 70% of those who are unemployed are youth between the ages of 15 and 35. And when you distill that a little bit further, you'll find that the majority of them are within the black, colored, and Indian communities. Yet you are saying, part of your big idea, you're going to remove those racial targets and quotas. How does that address that particular segment?
Well, I think if you look at employment equity legislation or you look at BBBEE, over the last, let's say, 15, 20 years that it's been implemented, it has failed to lift people out of poverty. It's failed to enable people. We've seen a further widening of the inequality gap, and we've seen a tiny, cadre or elite set of cadres who have benefited at the expense of the majority of South Africans. Now, what we are saying is we must focus on poverty as our mechanism for redress, and we need to make sure that we empower people in such a way, regardless of what their race is, that if they lack opportunity, we're able to allow them to gain opportunity because we have a more competitive environment, we've got a growing economy, and we've got one where there are jobs and there are opportunities for people to be able to make a difference in their lives. And I think that, if we get ourselves stuck in the ANC's frame of race, we, detract from the fact that, these are people and individuals' lives, and regardless of where they come from, we need to make sure that they can all live lives of meaning. And I think that's where our offer is different to what the status quo is.
Yeah. But if you, for example, you look at the drivers that would be driving that kind of disparity, part of it is skills, yes, but part of it is also whether these young people, where they are coming from, are given the opportunity, more than the fact that it's a poverty question, is that they are prioritized in terms of being given that opportunity. How do you address that?
Well, I think we need to recognize the historical injustices of the past. And I think in doing so in all of our other policy areas, and you'll see across the board, it's about making sure that regardless of where you come from, you still have good state services that are provided to you and you have the same access to opportunities that other people do. Yeah. Just because you happen to live in a township or you live in a rural community that is impoverished doesn't mean that you must have inferior quality education, doesn't mean that you must go to a clinic where you have to wait outside in line and hope that you're going to be able to see the doctor. Mean that when you go out
Sorry, Matt, unfortunately that line is giving up on us. Let's try and get Matt re-established there on that line. Head of Policy for the Democratic Alliance, Matt Cuthbert there. Cuthbert is joining us. They will try and reconnect with him. By the way, you can weigh in on that conversation on 072-110-5584. What do you make of the offering, the 8 key priorities outlined by the Democratic Alliance? How credible are the commitments that they are making? We're already hearing, for example, a big shift from the basic employment regulations, particularly when it comes to minimum wage. The Democratic Alliance saying they would look at SMMEs, particularly who are saying they can't afford to pay that minimum wage, and much of them would be exempt under the Democratic Alliance, and do away with the employment equity targets and the quotas, so to speak, under the Democratic Alliance government. Your thoughts on that, Matt? I think you're back with us. So I understand what you're saying in terms of making sure that there's equal opportunity, but you hear a lot of the young black unemployed graduates that we speak to. They'll speak about a lack of social networks, right? For example, to be able to help them. So you'll have people with huge social networks, largely white South Africans in this country, who will be able to have a heads up above them more than they would be able to get into those spaces. So things like employment equity and those targets certainly helps them get a foot in.
Yeah, so I think ultimately, whether you are a talented individual and you happen to be from a particular race group, yes, in some instances you can say that social capital definitely has an influence on it. But ultimately, in a merit-based society, regardless of where you come from and what you are, you should be able to succeed, and there should be an even playing field for everyone. And that's why, particularly in our proposal to replace BBBEE, we focus on replacing the existing system with one which actually focuses on things like education, focuses on services, focuses on a variety of other metrics as listed in the Sustainable Development Goals, which businesses by and large have adopted already. And you use public procurement as a tool for businesses to be able to contribute to these particular sectors, and on the basis of them contributing to these sectors has an impact on whether or not they're able to get state contracts. And I think that that's where there can really be a tool for empowerment to actually be able to uplift communities and to be able to re-establish communities in such a way that they are more equal and that people have equitable access to opportunity across the board. And I do take on board your concerns, of course. However, what we need is a growing economy, and if there's a growing economy and one in which opportunity is abound, it's going to be easier for people to find employment across the board. And I think that's why it's so fundamental from an economic point of view that we undertake all of these reforms side by side so that we find ourselves in a situation where we are not having to rely on the state and where we're actually able to build up a life of meaning for ourselves.
Yeah. There are those who have looked at the question of land, the large majority of South Africans being landless post-1994, and they've said that could certainly be a big campaign point for them. You don't seem to have prioritized that in the 8 areas that you're looking at. Any particular reason why?
So we actually do have land. It's in our section on how to enable people to rescue themselves from poverty and inequality. And obviously we are firmly in support of private property rights and the expansion of private property rights. So if we look at that, making sure that historical claims are resolved, making sure that we extend title deeds to people who have been sitting in RDP homes for a number of years but aren't able to own their properties, and making sure that we utilize existing state land to be able to redistribute that land to families who are due to be beneficiaries. And I think it's important for us to focus on this as a campaign issue, and that's why we have included it, because as we know, there are historical disparities, there's historical injustice around this, and it's important that we empower people with the opportunity to own land and for them to use that land as a means to create a better life for themselves. I think land as an object or as a concept is a very important thing because it allows you to generate wealth over time, and it allows you to then give that wealth over to your children and your descendants. And I think that that's something that people were disempowered from, particularly during the apartheid regime and the regime prior to that. And that's why it's so important that we expand these private property rights and that we enable people to be property owners rather than tenants of the state.
Yeah. So in your top point, you're saying that you will protect private ownership. So for you, the big thing would be to, I suppose, keep Section 25 of the Constitution exactly as it is.
Yes, that is correct, because it does give you the opportunity for redistribution as well and making sure that we address the historical injustices. But we've also seen the consequences of other political parties' platforms, which we've seen, from the likes of the EFF, and we've seen the consequences of those kinds of policies in Zimbabwe, in Venezuela, and how those have impacted the economy and how those have made, circumstances miserable for people living in those countries. And we believe that if we were to take a course of action like that, that it would have detrimental effects on our economy, detrimental effects on private property ownership, and it's something that we would not stand for. And this is why we've remained consistent in our protection of Section 25 of the Constitution.
What about land that the government deems necessary for the development of the people? I know you prioritize the utilization of government-owned land, but what about land that could be in private hands, that could be critical, for example, to building a bridge, to building a school, to ensuring that there is development in particular communities?
I think you make an excellent point there, Thabo, and that's exactly what we've included in our rescue plan as well, is that there should be opportunities for redistribution and housing opportunities within those specific government-owned tracts of land. I mean, the Department of Public Works and Infrastructure, the Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestries own vast tracts of land that could be used for land reform. But they've not been, because there's also not been sufficient budget allocated. There's been, a process that's been mired in corruption. And that's why it's exceptionally important for us to be able to use all of that land that's well situated, close to economic opportunity, to help people to be able to build up the kind of generational wealth they're looking for, also to make sure that they have the appropriate shelter, and the shelter which they are, afforded by the Constitution. And that's why I think it's a very critical point that you raise, and definitely something that we have included in our plan. Big
issue on load shedding, of course. Your emphasis is more towards renewables as the key drivers of the electricity generation going forward, more than it is on the coal-powered fire station. Why, when it's very clear that we still need base load at this particular point? Renewables have proven to not be able to give us the kind of sustainable electricity that we need.
Well, I think we understand as a party that, coal-fired power stations will be with us for some time, and we need to make sure that we balance the need to move towards greener, cleaner forms of energy with the fact that we need energy security. And load shedding is probably the single biggest risk to our economy. It keeps us confined to the 1% growth trap, and it's important that we have energy security above all else. However, such is the advance in technology and renewables and the ability for us to be able to diversify our energy mix through renewables, as we've done in the Western Cape and particularly in the city of Cape Town. I think it provides us with an opportunity to not only stabilize our electricity supply, make sure that it's available and be able to reduce load shedding, but also for us to be able to move towards a cleaner energy mix and one which is more sustainable for the environment. So I think that the two things are not necessarily mutually exclusive, but it's just about what your focus is going to be as a forward-thinking, organization, as a forward-thinking government, as opposed to, being stuck with the status quo and resigning yourself to the fact that this is what we are going to have to rely on.
Matt Cuthbert, appreciate your time. Thanks so much for coming on, DA Head of Policy Day. Right there, what are your thoughts and manifesto launch of the Democratic Alliance? They've presented their proposals. We've touched on some of them. Your views on 072-110-5584 on X at Newzroom 405.